right, you ever curious Herle Burlyites. Today on the podcast, the rarest of the rare. A 3 for appearance on the Herle Burly. Today, Peter Weltman, and we have no jacket for him. But Peter Weltman officially joins Francis Donald and John Stackhouse in the exalted, yet somehow still dubious, category pantheon of our only 3-time guests on this show. Peter, thank you for all the time you've given us. What the hell have you been thinking? Aren't you busy?
Well, I'm busy listening to the podcast, and that's what I'm busy doing. That's where I learn everything I need to know from the podcast, and it helps immeasurably. I understand what my staff is telling me. I understand what the politicians are talking about. Otherwise, I'd be like in a black hole somewhere, me and the dog. So it's just as well.
That's how everybody feels. Where would they be without the Herle Burly? Anyway, you'll all remember that Mr. Weltman is Ontario's independent financial accountability officer. So in advance of the Ontario election coming next week sometime, we'll talk to Peter about all the financial realities, considerations, and parameters to think about heading into that vote. What is the state of our finances? What are the assumptions that underlie those finances, those projections? How realistic are those? How sustainable are they? And what capacity is there to do new things? That's our subject today. Peter, how the hell are you?
I'm doing okay. I wish April weather would start to show its face and not, get out from behind the snowstorms that we've been having. But other than that, I'm doing okay.
I was talking to somebody in Vancouver yesterday who was in blazing sunlight and flowers surrounding them, and this Ottawa climate is for the birds, I'll tell you. But Saskatchewan had blizzards last week. April, tough month in Canada, disappointing month, heartbreaking month in Canada. You're at home, aren't you? I can tell.
I'm at home. I've moved from the small bedroom upstairs, which was in the middle of the house, of a small bungalow, by the way, with the dog, who was a puppy at the time, was barking at everything that moved. And I'm now down into the basement bedroom where my daughter was last time, and she's now off to Toronto doing her studies. So I reappropriated the bedroom, and I've got it sort of teed up as a bit of a home office studio thing. So yes, the long answer to a short question.
Kid barely gets her foot out the door and you take over her bedroom? What is that?
Well, I think she wasn't upset. It was like, I need to get out the door, and I needed to get out last year, but I have to wait a little bit. So.
Hey, what is your back to office policy with your team?
I'm still trying to figure it out. So here's my problem. Because I get to do that while I'm on a guest on your podcast. I get to tell you my problem. So problem one is we've been far more productive working from home. And not that we weren't productive before, it's just we really kicked it up a level since we've all been working from home. Problem two is we always had a work from home policy long before the pandemic, and that was my competitive advantage to recruiting. That's gone now. That's out the window.
Right.
So three is it's hard for me to make a business case to require folks to come back to the office when, in fact, we've been performing pretty freaking well without being there. So what we're trying to do is by stealth. Some of the folks are coming back once a week, and they're hoping some of their team joins them, and that's slowly starting to happen. But I think where we're going to land is probably, maybe several staff retreats a year instead of one, and maybe they'll be, everybody in the office one day a week. It's just, we're trying to get our heads around that. But I miss it. I miss the people. That's what I love about the job. But we're still figuring it out.
Right. Yeah, I think everybody is, but I think Canada is a bit unique in this regard. I think Canadians are less interested in returning to the office than, or employers are less demanding about people return to the office. One of the two. I'm not sure which it is. Than in other places in the world. I hear business people tell me that in places like New York or London, offices are 100% people back to work, and in Canada, it's not happening.
Slow going. Yeah, it's slow going. No, I check in with my son in Israel because they're always a little ahead of, they have been ahead of us on the COVID thing, and they're all back, but they're not back full time in the office. They're back 3 days a week. They have sort of schedules figured out who comes in when, and that's probably where we're going to land. I would expect.
Right. Cool. So listen, what I want to do is you put out a report recently on the state of Ontario's finances, and it was a very detailed look at them. And I had the opportunity to go through it, and I had some questions for you. And what I want to do is lay out the scenario for listeners about exactly what the state of the finances is going into the election, so that people can properly assess the budget next week, and people can properly assess the campaign commitments that the various parties make. Make sense to you?
Absolutely. That's why we did it.
Okay. Well, can you start by just giving us a sort of a quick summary of what you
Sure.
found what you found about the finances? What the
Yeah.
report
So
says?
I just want to say, normally we come out after the government. So the government will do a budget. We come out afterwards. This time around, because the government delayed its budget date, we thought we made a quick switch and said, let's get out ahead of it, because this will be the only independent, nonpartisan baseline look at Ontario's fiscal framework in advance of the budget. Everything that comes after this is largely going to be driven by the election, and that's all sorts of considerations. So harking back to the title of the Curse of Politics episode from yesterday, Dumbass Dividend, I'll just use dividend instead of dumbass. We're looking pretty good. I mean, we're forecasting a surplus 5 years out. We're forecasting a balanced budget in about a year and a half's time. And if I'd come on 2 years ago, can you imagine me coming on here April 2020 as we're locking everything down, as the price of gas was 62 cents a liter? I remember clearly, as Jason Kenney would announce about oil futures trading in negative territories. And if I were to come on and say, yeah, in 3 years from now, we're going to run a surplus and we're going to have the fastest revenue growth that we have seen in 20 years. And we are going to get the debt to GDP, if it stays as on course, we're going to get the debt to GDP ratio way down to where it was before the Great Recession and just around the time. Today's supposed to be National Weed Day. You would have thought that I'd been sampling everything at the Ontario Cannabis Store if I'd come on and done that sort of thing. So short answer, we're projecting an $8.7 billion deficit for the fiscal year just ending. But as I said, by 2025, 26, 27, we're looking at a surplus of $7.1 billion. And it's largely a revenue story.
So this is, how current is this? Because Mike Crawley in the CBC is reporting this morning that the government's announced $10 billion worth of spending since the beginning of March.
Yeah, so this doesn't include everything. I saw Mike's piece this morning, doesn't include everything there. It does include the childcare piece. It does include the license sticker rebate. It doesn't include the gas tax. Anything that was announced up to March 28th is included in our report. Anything that comes after that is incremental to it.
Right. Okay. So I was struck, not necessarily by the quick end to the large deficits that we saw pop up during COVID, because we're exiting COVID and exiting all that, but I was struck by the large surpluses you forecast a few years from now. So balancing the budget has historically been a pretty difficult thing to do in Ontario. Most governments don't do it. And several governments have tried greatly to do it and, barely got there, as Kathleen Wynne did after a lot of austerity in certain areas. And now all of a sudden, here are big surpluses. So I actually thought Ontario kind of had a structural deficit. So what's happened?
So we have some tremendous revenue gains, well above forecast. It's been a difficult time to be a forecaster. I think it always is, but especially the last 2 years. So we have seen revenue gains that have been really off the charts. In February, we released what we call our long-term budget outlook. We do a 30-year outlook just sort of get the sense as to where things are. And yeah, you could see there was wasn't necessarily a structural deficit, but certainly we were going to see program spending increase, grow faster than revenues over the long haul. Now, and we were looking at a deficit of 2.8 back then by 2023-24. Now we're looking at a surplus of 1.2, and that's in 2 months, largely because of tax revenue. So what you've had happen is you've had a huge amount of support come in from the federal government and to some degree the province. So about 85% of it in Ontario came from the feds. And that supported both people who couldn't work It supported companies who couldn't sell anything. It helped them pay their rent. It helped them pay their staff. And once we started coming out of COVID, instead of people being, desperately in debt or, out of business, and a lot of people were out of business, but a ton more could have been, they had cash, right? And they started spending it. And nobody really, somebody must have foreseen it, but we didn't. And a whole lot of other people didn't foresee the huge boost in revenues. Now, that boost in revenues, as our forecast shows, tapers off, by year 3. So this isn't going to be on forever. By year 4 and 5, we're back to sort of traditional real GDP growth of around 1.9, which is lower than it was in the last 30 years.
So how does economics work? If it can move that quickly one direction, can it move that quickly the other direction?
Well, a recession is a typical example. It moved that quickly before, right? When the pandemic hit, we had, negative 5.6, we had contraction. I love when economists say negative growth. I always sort of scratch my head and, try to think it through a little. So we had a contraction in GDP of 5.6 really from one year to the next. And now we've got, swinging the other way. So yeah, it can move that quickly. The difference here is this recession was forecastable, right? We saw it coming. We saw the shutdown slowly, like a bunch of dominoes, as people started shutting down in China and they started shutting down other places. In Italy, you could start to see things happening. So you knew it was coming. Most recessions sneak up on you.
So let's get into the numbers a little bit. The first thing is that jumped out at me was your inflation assumptions. So you are really expecting the Bank of Canada to be pretty quickly successful at wrestling inflation back to its 2% target. Because I think within 3 years, you're projecting 1.9% inflation and then out like that for the duration.
Yeah.
2 questions about that. One of which is, what are the implications if the Bank of Canada is not successful at doing that and inflation continues to be where it is or even go higher? And secondly, what are the implications for the economy of the Bank of Canada being successful?
So we assume 2 things. We assume not so much that everything's riding on the Bank of Canada. We assume that the inflation pressures we're seeing now are temporary. They're caused by some pretty crazy things happening in the world, the pandemic shutting down supply chain people, having money in their pockets, like I mentioned before, trying to buy stuff. Supply can't keep up. Bottlenecks in the supply chains because some countries are shutting down, some countries aren't. Some countries have workers that are homesick and some countries don't. So you got to gum up in the supply chain, which causes prices to go up temporarily, hopefully. Then, of course, we have this thing that happened in February, a war in the Ukraine, which is an energy producer, Russian gas producer. So that's affected energy markets. Not quite as much here, although natural gas prices are way up. So these are kind of shocks that we assume. And remember, every forecast is based on assumptions. We don't have a crystal ball, and nor than does anybody else. We assume that these are temporary and they will eventually revert to normal. The risk, of course, is that they're not. And so maybe that gets to your second question. Or your first part of your first question. Our forecast assumes that program spending kind of stays on a certain track at 3.6, and it assumes that we won't see wage renegotiations to meet this heavy inflationary period right now. That could happen. We mentioned that in our report. There could be some inflationary pressures that impact program spending that we don't call for right now because we think inflation will be temporary. If the bank is successful in bringing inflation down, or inflation comes down because we think these are temporary measures, and the bank is helping move that, sure, hopefully it doesn't get as bad as it did in the early 80s where we had a really serious recession. But we'll have to see. Our assumption is things will sort of taper back to the way they were.
In terms of public sector wages,
I hope so, but I don't know.
Yeah. In terms of public sector wages, they've been under such restraint for such a long period of time in Ontario that I would have thought that there was pressure building to increase public sector wages regardless of inflation. And now that inflation is running currently in the 5% range, how is it going to be possible to hold public sector wages to the kind of net zero place they've been for years now?
I think I think it'll come down to supply and demand, right? I mean, we've seen. Let's pick on nurses, and I don't want to pick on nurses, but let's use nurses as an example. A lot of them are leaving the profession. A lot of doctors are leaving the profession. They're burnt out, and at the end of the day, if you aren't offering a wage that is attractive enough to bring people into the profession, you're going to have to do something about it. Either you're going to have to figure out a way to deliver that service without those people, or you're going to have to pay them more to attract them to come in. So these wage pressures have been building and will continue to build. And like, as you mentioned, with this inflation, these inflation numbers, I think bank came out, or StatsCan came out this morning at, I think 6.7 was our rate last month, the highest I think it's been in a heck of a long time. Remind me to get in my chocolate bar story about inflation. I'll do that later.
Excellent.
But you will see Bill. Now, there's other ways around it, right? The government's been pretty adamant about keeping to its Bill 124, which caps public sector wage rates increases at 1% for a 3-year period. Our forecast, by the way, takes that into account. So there are certain labor groups that are under that 1%, certain ones that exit that 1%. And we assume in our forecast, we know which ones are under that 1%. We know they're coming out of it. And we assume we're going to see a return to sort of average wage growth, which was 2.2. But the other way around that too for the government, and they did this with the nurses, you can offer a signing bonus, right? You don't have to necessarily increase the wages, but you can do a signing bonus, you can do another bonus, you can do a one-off payment that would, mathematically be equivalent, but it doesn't entrench or embed an automatic kind of increase into your salary structure. So that's an option that's available as well. And we're seeing them starting to use that.
But one way or another, it's quite possible that this track understates public sector wages.
Absolutely. I think right now, and we're careful about saying that, we could see inflationary pressures that put a lot of pressure on the government to raise wages in order to retain the workforce that they need to deliver the programs that they are charged with delivering.
Right. So last week, we embarked on a storytelling journey here. As I say this, my subconscious mind is compelling me to slip in a tortured reference to the band Journey. But that would be frivolous in the context of where I'm going with this message, so I'll just stick to the script, faithfully. All right, the story we're telling here is a big one we'll tell over a number of weeks. It's about our presenting sponsor, Telus, and their commitments to ESG, environmental, social, and governance. What Telus is actually doing with their world-leading technology and their compassion, from agriculture to healthcare to sustainability, to put the well-being of our customers, communities, and the planet first. Just one example is the role Telus played in the largest ever marine cleanup in BC's history. Unfortunately, we've become almost inured to data like this. But every year, 8.8 million tons of marine debris, industrial, residential, and single-use plastics enter our oceans and end up on British Columbia's shorelines. I don't have to tell you what that does to the ecosystem of the region. In a massive joint effort, the province's Clean Coast, Clean Waters initiative ran for 6 weeks and covered 300 kilometers of coastline. Telus's role was to cover the cost of a 42-day excursion up and down the coast to collect, transport, and recycle more than 200 tons of marine debris. With active support from the Wiikinoi Nation, Heiltsuk Nation, Kitasoo Hai Nation, and Gitgathla Nation. The cleanup also provided jobs to 180 people during the COVID pandemic, in what was clearly a difficult time in BC's travel and tourism industry. This is just one story, Herle Burlyites. It happens to coincide with Earth Day later this week on the 22nd. But Telus is a company driven by social purpose, and the idea that doing good business is also doing what's right for people and the world. Let's make the future friendly is a call to action that animates them every day. You can read more about it all in Telus's just released Sustainability and ESG report at telus.com/sustainability. Okay, so growth in spending, according to your report, in all areas other than health care And that includes education, that includes child and social services, that includes policing. The growth in spending in those areas is below the current rate of inflation, obviously, and is also lower than it has been historically, even under this government.
Right.
What are the implications of that, and is that a sustainable thing to do?
So two things to keep in mind there. So one is that let's pick on education for a second. I picked on nurses, now we'll pick on education. So when we say historically, during the previous government, not just under Wynne, but under McGuinty, there was a significant investment or spending, however you want to term it, in education. We had full day daycare, reduced class sizes. So a rate of growth of education spending was higher than it had been. So that sort of rate of growth, if you will, when we're looking at a 20-year average, makes up part of that average. So yes, even if you stand still today, you're still going to be lower than you were 15 years ago because of that high spend. So that explains part of it. That explains most of it, because our forecast again is based on enrollment. So enrollment's about 0.4% of that wage growth of the spending growth in education. We look at the teachers' salaries and which part of those are under the Bill 124 and which aren't. General growth in capital spend that's required, that's associated with how many buildings and how many schools and that sort of thing. So we've been able to sort of get a little deeper under the covers than before, and we're able to look at some of these individual cost drivers and project forward. So again, though, as you mentioned before, the risk is wage inflation. Enrollment doesn't switch that dramatically. Wage inflation could.
Right. I guess one of the reasons I was asking is that I think it was Don Drummond who explained to me that, if you arbitrarily set spending tracks at a low level, it's not sustainable because eventually you're going to have to catch up. Like you're just creating a problem that will ultimately come back, and you'll have to spend a whack of money to solve that problem. Might we be seeing something like that with education on this track?
It's possible. It's possible. So I agree with Don Drummond's statement. In our previous long-term budget outlook, we included, and even in this one, we include a component in there. This time around, we called it enrichment. Last time around, we called it catch-up. And right. I think the simple way to look at it is not catch-up, but catch-up. So some people spell it. The thing to keep in mind is that you got a bunch of stuff you're delivering. You've got buildings, you've got equipment. All these things wear out. You've got teachers wear out, right? I mean, they get tired. They need to, maybe they need to retire, whatever the case is. So all this stuff needs to be maintained. And if you aren't and we saw this with hospitals, right? Let's just dive right into hospitals. We had lousy hospital capacity in Ontario before the pandemic because there was a significant spending freeze, and you know about that on hospital spending. And as a result, hospitals were running at 96% capacity in Ontario before the pandemic. We did a report on that, well over 100 in most of the big centers. And boom, pandemic hits. So yeah, you can't, he's right. If you're not funding it at an adequate level today, you will have to do one of two things in the future. You're going to have to dump a bunch more money in to catch up, to fix the broken windows, to replace the retired teachers, to upgrade the quality of the equipment, or you have to find another way to deliver that service without having to spend that catch-up money, and that's much harder.
Right. Okay, my next question has a little bit of a political preamble, but I'm certainly not expecting a political answer, so I don't want to put you in that position. But the current government campaigned in the last election when it took office that the government of Ontario spent too much money and that it was inefficient, and the government could be run more efficiently with less spending. What has this government, COVID aside, if you could possibly extract COVID from it, what has this government done to spending that is different from what the previous government was doing?
So where I sit, unfortunately, is I can't get into the nitty gritty of some of the really small or changes or adjustments that might have been made, but certainly some things that I've seen, I think we've all seen. And we don't yet know the impact on spending. We've seen a lot more delivery of education, virtually. Hasn't had really an impact on spending just yet, because nothing else structurally has changed with the program. We've seen a concerted effort, certainly out of the Treasury Board, and I guess now out of Finance, because it followed the minister, to try to modernize, digitize delivery of public services. Again, not sure what the impact has been on spending. It probably haven't seen a significant change yet, but these are things that happen over time. So I've not, and I wouldn't be fair because I'm not a program evaluator. That's not what we do. But when we do our forecasts, we haven't, let me just put it this way, we haven't adjusted our growth rates in any, significantly to take into, account any significant changes to program delivery that would necessitate us to change our growth rates. So we haven't seen anything out there that says, holy crap, we've gotten education spending down by 1.5%. We're going to have to adjust our. We haven't seen anything like that.
Right. So my guess is that most of you never gave much thought to the phrase supply chains before the pandemic set in. My further guess is that most of you have absolutely thought a great deal about the subject in the past year or so. I certainly have. It's entered the lexicon. We have discovered the fragility of our overseas supply chains, and because everything is connected to everything else, we've seen disruptions in our North American networks. And Canadian manufacturers, which are heavily reliant on foreign suppliers for crucial inputs and on foreign markets to sell their products, have turned out to be especially vulnerable. So the last 2 years has been sort of a brutal education. Now, you've heard me say here before that there's no more important player in Canada's supply chains than our sponsor, CN. The economy is basically supported by rail transport. Pretty much everything moves by train. Anyway, there have been some recent developments that should help CN do its job better, which is nothing but good. Earlier this year, the federal government created a national supply chain task force. The idea is to use lessons learned and streamline Canada's cargo transportation system, removing bureaucratic obstacles and red tape. Then, last week's federal budget contained several measures to maximize the flow of cargo by road and by rail, along with some helpful improvements to the vitally important seaport of Vancouver. There was also a welcome emphasis in the budget on extracting and transporting critical minerals. Canada has spectacular reserves of these minerals, which are crucial to aerospace and high-tech production. Cell phones, batteries, computers, and cars cannot operate without them. And right now, China has the critical mineral market just about cornered. Canada not only has critical minerals in abundance, it has the clean energy and vast open spaces required to process them. The federal government has made critical minerals a priority and is now putting up money to help build the necessary infrastructure. CN is keen to do its part, moving the minerals from mines to processing factories and onward to customers anxious to wean themselves off all that reliance on foreign suppliers. This all makes perfect sense. It's a smart play, it's overdue, and it's welcome. Okay. The other thing that was prominent in the last election was support to businesses that want to either invest in Ontario from other locations or to expand their operations in Ontario. The previous government had something called a Growth and Prosperity Fund, and the current government ran against that idea and said that we shouldn't be subsidizing business. Has that policy changed? Because I noticed a lot of auto announcements recently, for instance, that seem to have a provincial government funding component to them.
You know this probably better than anybody in the world. An election platform promise does not equal government policy necessarily, right? And that's probably as far as I'll go on that. I haven't, again, noticed anything different enough that would, affect the way that we forecast spending. Right. So there may be.
They didn't abolish that practice.
We've seen announcements with, loans, grants, et cetera, to, the auto industry to build EVs or build batteries. There's the government, there's been announcements 3 times a day over the last number of months about all kinds of stuff going on. And that's the regular business of government. So it doesn't really impact, I haven't seen a big enough change to notice anything in our forecasting.
Okay. So it sounds to me like the good news on the fiscal front is not due to significantly changed spending patterns. It is due to revenue, as you say in your report.
Purely a revenue story. It really has nothing to do with the spending.
So where's all this money coming from? And as a related question, are Ontario income taxes fully indexed to inflation?
Are anybody's income taxes fully indexed to inflation? So the money is coming through taxes. If there is indexing, it usually happens later. So it's not going to happen now. And the government has, in some ways, and the feds have been too, and actually governments right across the country have been lucky in some respects. The revenue has come, as I mentioned before, people got an unprecedented amount of support through the pandemic. So they had cash in their jeans, so to speak. And I'm not suggesting everybody did. And I'm not suggesting a lot of people weren't really badly affected by that. I don't want to say that for a second, because we all were. And that was the reality of the pandemic. But different than another recession, people did have more money in their pockets than they would have had in a previous recession. That money got spent. Companies' costs were basically, a lot of those were subsidized by the government. So a lot of their rent and a lot of other things, or a lot of programs out there to help businesses survive, large and small businesses. And so people are walking out of this reasonably whole, as if they haven't, they missed a little, but they haven't missed a ton economically, and now they're back spending. And when you compare to what had happened, with a contraction of 5%, now we're seeing spending, and that's why you're seeing huge tax revenue. And it's a windfall. It's a windfall tax revenue. Inflation drives it even more. So it's mostly a growth and revenue story. On top of that, you've got an inflation piece that raises the nominal GDP, which is really what gets taxed. Nominal GDP is real GDP plus the GDP inflator, and that is the
explain that in English.
Interest.
It's a really important concept. Explain that.
Yeah, no, it is an important concept
because nominal GDP in your report runs much higher than real GDP.
Yes,
right.
And nominal GDP takes into account price inflation across the economy. So it's a little different than CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, which looks at a basket of consumer goods. Nominal GDP looks at goods right across the economy and services right across the economy, measures those price levels versus previous years, and then you do the math and you get your inflation number. So, gasoline, right? Huge jump in the price of gas for a whole bunch of reasons. So I'm just taking that as an example, but you had a jump in the price of hotels, of restaurants. There's a whole bunch of stuff. This price has gone up for a whole bunch of reasons. And easy example, you're paying HST, right? HST is a variable tax. And if the price of the underlying good has gone up by 10%, then there's an additional 13% of that 10% that the government gets to collect that it otherwise wouldn't have collected. So there is the difference, on a real GDP basis, that good would have been worth $1. The government would have got its 13 cents. With a nominal GDP, let's just assume that the good is now worth $1.10. So the government gets, what is 14.3 cents instead of 13 cents. So you work that across the economy. It's a pretty big pop in revenue. Will that catch up? It could. If inflation stays embedded, then the government will be under pressure to raise wages to allow folks to be able to maintain, their standard of living, if you will. So there will be pressure if inflation keeps going. If inflation expectations set in, and I think that's why the bank has acted so quickly, because inflation is driven by what people think. And which is great because it gets me to my chocolate bar story. So inflation is, and expectations are, when you expect the price of something to go up, you're going to buy more of it today so that you don't pay the higher price later. Now, you and I probably remember that. I certainly remember going to the corner store, which there aren't too many anymore, with my 15 cents, and I could buy a chocolate bar. And 2 years later, that chocolate bar costs 20, or a year later,
7 Twizzlers. Or 7 Twizzlers.
That was inflation. And then you'd say, geez, I better buy 2 chocolate bars today because next week it might go up to, 25 cents.
Right.
Today, and for the last 30 years, when you're looking to buy something, what is your reaction? Your reaction is, I'm going to wait until it goes on sale. Well, that's different, right? That's really a different way of looking at consumer behavior. So if we get to a point where people are saying, geez, I better buy this today before it goes up tomorrow, then we got a big problem with inflation. And we're not there yet. But, inflation expectations, sometimes people, that's a lagging indicator in some respects. People might not perceive it to be until it's already there. Hope that makes some sense.
Yeah. So right now, though, inflation's all upside for government. There's no downside to inflation right now for government. It's just flooding them with revenue right now.
That's right.
Is it fair for me to characterize the difference in taxation between real GDP and nominal GDP as a tax increase?
I suppose you could, because it is, you're raising more revenue from the same number of people. Now, if people have been making more money, so the net impact may be the same, right? So if my inflation is up 6.7%, but for some reason my business revenues are up or my profits are up 6.7% from the previous month, then I'm even. So that's really a more appropriate way to do it. But I think...
But if your salary is going up 1%...
Exactly. So there's a short-term windfall happening right now in Ontario and across the country, where a lot of the structural costs of the programs through wage negotiations and contracts are reflect a previous era of inflation. Hopefully it's a very era about to come back rapidly. But right now it's a windfall. So that's, and I think that's the point we made in our report, is right now there's a windfall happening in revenues. It's looking really good for the fiscal situation, much better than it's looked in a very long time. And then I say in the report, and I've said publicly too, but it looks great now. We still have demographic pressures in this province, right? In the 30s, we have a lot more people getting a lot older, going to be consuming a lot more healthcare and producing a lot less for the economy. That's an issue, and that's something that is going to happen.
What are some of those big pressures you see coming up? Aging population, obviously. Climate adaptation.
Climate is like, climate adaptation is huge, and we've done some work in that area, and which I'm really proud of. We pulled off some pretty interesting stuff. And it really was the cost of what is it going to cost you to keep the stuff you own adapted for the climate to come, and how much more money you're going to have to spend just to keep the thing functional. You're going to have to put in more air conditioners in your buildings to mitigate the extra heat, et cetera. That's going to be a structural, long-term, expensive. That's a huge, huge problem, I think, which will hit us. It's hitting us now. It's going to hit us more and more down the road. How is it going to hit us? I don't know. I think it's hard to predict whether it's all going to come at once or whether it's going to come gradually or a combination of both. We do know, though, because we have experience with demographic changes, we've got a pretty solid comfort level in projecting that. So those are two huge things. I think the third thing driven by climate change, and this is me riffing a little bit, I think you're going to see a ton of immigration. Canada's actually not going to be a terrible place to be. We got a pile of water. Water is going to become a really important commodity. It is already, and it's going to become more so as places start getting hotter and drying up. People are going to want to live here, so that's going to add some pressure down the road. There's going to be a lot of things to keep an eye out for in the long term.
And these things are largely unaccounted for in current fiscal planning.
The demographic piece is. Yes, I mean, I would say we don't see it accounted for. We say it's going to cost you this much more money down the road. We're not seeing where that extra money has been allocated. Certainly on the climate adaptation piece, that I think is fair to say is in infancy, may be too strong a word. People have been working on this for a while, but whether it's being factored into government budgets, I think that's only just starting to get some headroom, if you will, in those discussions.
But it sounds like it wouldn't be wise to use all of your fiscal capacity without factoring in some of these things.
I think it's important. We're just before an election. you have, it's not the project management triangle. Let's call it the fiscal management triangle. You have revenues, you have expenses, and you have debt. And those three have to be managed and maintain an equilibrium. So I would say that you need to, look to the long term and make sure you have the governmental firepower, usually that's money, to allow you to address things that you have a reasonable assurance are going to happen in the long term. And that's where the debt piece comes in, right? As the federal government did, they were, I think, you're a great person to talk to about that.
What would have happened if COVID had happened to Canada?
Right?
Peter, have you ever done this thought experiment? What would have happened if COVID had happened to Canada in 1994? Could we have introduced the CERB?
I would say my quick and easy answer is we would not have had the money to introduce it in the same degree. However, and the reason economists are great, on the one hand, on the other hand, right? On the other hand, if everybody's in the same boat, then everybody, all countries are going to have trouble financing their debt, or they're not going to have trouble. But we certainly did not have the fiscal room to do in 94 what we did in the last 2 years. If you want to measure on the basis that we measure things today, there are other things too. You have there's a lot more cash around in the world today than there was in 94. There are a lot fewer structural impairments to moving that money around than there used to be. So there's a lot of other factors that come into play. But no, we did not have the fiscal space in 94 that we did recently. And that's
Oddly, I had more cash in 94 than I do today, but that's just irrelevant.
Yeah, well, I did too, because I didn't have kids in 94. So, but I was going to say, you got to make sure you got the fiscal room to deal with what's coming. And that's where the debt piece comes in. The debt piece also comes in if interest rates start to go crazy. The interest payments start to eat up an awful lot more of your program spending availability than you would have had before. Right now, we're not in that situation. Rates are low. They're expected to remain fairly low. And I'll quote Francis Donald, there are reasons why we think interest rates are probably not going to go like they did before, and largely due to demographics. The spending side and the revenue side are important because ultimately, if people are requiring programs and you're running a deficit, that means that people aren't willing to pay all of the taxes required to fund the programs that they enjoy. Now, there's some things you need to do to invest in the future, and they benefit future generations. And Don Drummond will tell you this too, is that if you're buying stuff that future generations can enjoy, it's fine to borrow because everybody gets to pay for it. If you're borrowing to fund current benefits, that's not fair on future generations.
Right. This is, again, kind of political, so answer it as carefully as you need to.
Free country, I'll answer what I can, and I won't when I can't.
Right. So people say elections matter, and Joe Biden says, don't tell me what your values are. Show me your budget, and I'll know what your values are. So can you discern from the data, and I know that COVID complicates this enormously, but can you discern through the data what's different about this government from the government it replaced?
I think what I would say from the data is that, and not having had the benefit of being here in this job before this government was sworn in, I'm not seeing a dramatic difference between the two governments. And COVID does complicate things because we've seen massive amounts of money move around that we've never seen before. But if I look at the core programs like health and education, this government was looking to find a way to do online classes, and then the pandemic came in and said, by the way, you have to do them. So whether that was in the works before or not, I'm not entirely sure. So there was certainly that piece of it. I think there are key programs that got maybe a little bit a little wonky, and I'm using that very, very loosely. And I'm sure the advocates for these programs, I'm thinking autism in particular, probably wouldn't use the word wonky. I'm sure they have much stronger words for that, but I'm got to be careful. So that was a policy that was put in place, and then it was kind of blown up, and then it was rethought and then put back. And meanwhile, there was a period of time where people got severely impacted by that delay. The dollars aren't really that much different pre and post. We saw. I'm thinking the big policy moves that come to mind. The auctions, the energy auctions that got changed, and that added a lot of cost to the budget. But again, not masses. A couple billion here or there, which on 175 billion isn't huge, but it was incremental. And now we're seeing a government that was tearing up charging stations, putting them back in. So at the end of the day, governing is about making sure you're giving people what they say they want and what you think they need today and long term. And that's what these guys are doing, and that's what the previous government did too.
Okay, so balanced budgets and then surpluses can give people the impression that the economy is very strong. But you actually project real GDP in a couple of years to be 1.9%, to grow by 1.9%, and to stay at that level off into the foreseeable future.
Yep.
Let me use a technical economic term. That sucks, doesn't it?
Yes, it sucks. It stinks. It sucks. It's awful. And it's not going to pay my health care when I'm old.
Right.
I haven't done the work to be able to definitively say that, but kind of riffing at the high level. No, we got to do better than that. We've done better than that in the past, and we need to do better than that going forward. Or we're going to have to rethink a lot of the stuff that we take for granted. It's not strong enough. So let's get back to the triangle again. So then you're a government, you're saying 1.9 sucks because there's something I can do on the spending side today that turns that 1.9 to maybe 2.5 or 3 or something.
That's the federal theory, right? That's the federal theory right now.
Well, I mean, I think everybody's got that theory or that desire. I mean, how do you do it? What do you do about it? How much do you spend? Those are the hard parts. So it's nice to say that's what you want to do, but then you got to do it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So the opposition have made some promises about what they want to do. The government has a budget coming up. All of this is going to impact on the financial situation we've just been talking about. Let's start with, I just got my rebate check for my license car vehicle registration, right? And you know what? Politically, I've got to say it's brilliant, right? Because it is nice to get a check for $600 in the mail. But what does that cost?
1.1 billion. And actually, I think it was a little higher. I think it was maybe 1.7 because they did it retroactive. But going forward, it'll be 1.1. And that excludes an assumed growth rate in the number of vehicle registrations and license stickers that would have happened normally. Although that growth rate maybe wouldn't be what it used to be, given the nature of electric vehicles, given the nature of, all that sort of stuff. I don't think people drive as much as they used to. And I know there's data in the States to prove that. Their highway fund had to get topped up recently because they just weren't collecting enough gas tax because people are driving more efficient cars and just aren't buying as much gas.
Right.
But yeah, that's 1.1. And we have in our report, we say, if you were, and there's a sensitivity analysis, I think it's on page 8 or whatever. And it says, if you were to adjust revenues by $1 billion today, here's what the impact will be 5 years out. Right. And that number isn't coming to me instantaneously. But it's significant, and it's I think it's 6.7 billion or something to that, because there is that compounding growth, right?
Right.
That you're not getting, and you have to borrow money to pay for that. So you're adding another 6, 7 or more to the debt, and then you're paying extra interest on top of that. So it's not cheap to do that sort of stuff. It adds up. Anytime you do something permanent, it adds up. If you were to lower HST by 1% today, by year 5, you'll have used up, there will be no surplus in year 5. That 7.2 or 7.1 is gone. That's what it would cost. And then it just keeps growing from there. So that's why we put that table in. We put out a report. This is the baseline. This is what the future looks like from our crystal ball. Now, we know there are going to be changes.
It's actually a chart that every vote, I saw it. It's brilliant. It's a chart that every voter should have, because you can look at spending or tax commitments, and understand what they're going to cost, right?
Yeah.
Over time. It's really handy. It should be distributed to every household.
Well, they can all get it on our website, right? Everybody has access. There's no restrictions. You don't need to be you don't need to have special access to the FAO to be able to get our reports. I just thought I'd say that.
Is it your job to look at the other parties' spending plans? Are you reviewing platforms?
No, we don't. We don't have. I was waiting for that question. We don't have a mandate for that. Some folks have talked to me about it from within government. It's not an easy thing to do. I think from a policy point of view, there's a lot of merit to it, because then you take out, you add trust, right, to some level in the numbers. And so they do this in the Netherlands. They've been doing it for decades, because they have coalition governments. Parties put out their platforms. They get costed by the CPB, which is the organization there. So off the table, you're not arguing the costs of your policies anymore, and whether that guy's lying or this woman is, inflating or whatever. You're arguing about the merits of the policy. And then when you get together to form a coalition, you got the numbers on the table. They've been vetted by an independent agency. So there's some policy merit in doing so. It's not cheap. The PBO is doing it. They had to almost triple their budget to get there. And it's not without risk. You have to be able to ensure that parties are confident you aren't going to leak stuff. And, you have to make sure. So it takes time. It's not something you can just do by looking at a spreadsheet and doing the numbers.
Okay. So now I'm going to put you in an unfair position, but you have studied some of these areas. So for instance, I know you've studied long-term care, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the NDP say, among other things, that they're going to make all long-term care public and not-for-profit. They're going to build small, modern, family-like homes in all parts of the province. They're going to staff up with full-time, well-paid, well-trained caregivers. And they're going to clear the wait list so nobody has to wait years for a bed and even longer for a culturally appropriate home. So, frankly, long-term care is an area I'm pretty concerned about. Those sound like terrific things to do, all of them. Any idea what that would cost?
I really wish I did, but I don't. And I agree with you. They sound terrific. I had a father long-term. Well, he was in the hospital. He was in long-term care for 3 weeks, because that's when he was able to get in there. It sounds wonderful. There are best practices, especially I think in the Netherlands and in Scandinavian countries, where they do these small modular kind of community integrated homes. I could tell you if I had the details. What if we just take
one piece of it? What if we just take the public piece, taking the homes away from for profit and making them all publicly owned, not-for-profit homes? Do you have if the government were to take over all long-term care homes in the province, what does that cost?
Yeah. Well, I think that would be costly, because there's two components to long-term care. One is the ownership of the capital, which is where the private companies are interested in. They get to develop, they get to build a building, they get to receive a regular payment for that. And they get an asset that, pays a regular dividend. And if you're a pension fund, that's always a nice thing to have. And you maybe get some capital appreciation from it. And then there's the care component. And there are some places where they outsource that care component to somebody who is in the business. And there are some places that try to do it themselves as a mishmash. And that's, I think, where, in my mind, where the issue really is how do you incent folks to provide really good care? And is it by making them a subsidiary of a building company? I'm not sure that a building company is going to have a lot of management time and focus on a care piece. So to me, that's, I would break it out and say, okay, where is the problem, right? What problem are we trying to solve? I think we're trying to solve a care and accessibility problem. Right. If the government was going to build it all by themselves, they'd have to borrow a crap load more money to build these buildings. And in some respects, by having private operators build the buildings, government's basically just paying rent. So there's capital that's available potentially to invest in the care piece, and maybe you work on the care piece. I think a piece that came up in the podcast yesterday was when this government came in, they took out the inspectors to a large degree. That's not necessarily enhancing care. That's allowing. There are consequences to doing that sort of thing, and there may be, maybe that's where we need to focus. When you raise the rate of the wages of PSWs and you provide more, like the 4 hours care every day, that raises the cost too. That's in our forecast. I don't have that number in front of me. That's probably something I could have broken out specifically for you, but yeah.
They also want to add mental health to OHIP. Do you have any idea what that would cost?
Like, it all comes down to, so what do you mean by that? Mental health is a pretty big word. Do you mean
they guarantee 6 visits of the year to a therapist?
So 6 visits a year to a therapist. Is that a 1 hour? Let's assume it's a 1 hour visit. Therapists charge all over the map, but let's just pick a number. Let's say $200. So 6 visits, $200. Do the math, $1,200 a year times, how many people will use it? So you've got 14 million people in the province. A lot of those are babies. They're not going to likely use it. There are going to be a whole bunch of people that don't use it. So maybe you have, just to pick a nice number, maybe 10 million people decide, or 5 million. Let's start with 10 and divide by 2. It's easier to do the math. So then you got 1.2 billion divided by 2. So grosso modo, it could be between, maybe $600 million a year. Maybe it's $1.2 billion a year. And that grows, obviously, as the population grows. You have a certain growth rate that you're going to embed in that. And then, of course, there's the other side of it is, what could be the impacts of that? And, maybe that's not an important conversation or discussion when you're talking healthcare, because healthcare gets a bit of a free pass on outcomes and that sort of thing. I'm not saying that gratuitously, but I am throwing it out there. Is that the right number of visits, right? And maybe for some people it's nowhere near enough, and for some people maybe it's perfect.
The Liberals have a dignity plan. It has, among its elements, are this: replace the minimum wage with a regional living wage starting at $16. Provide all Ontario workers with portable drug, dental, and mental health services. Match up to $1,000 in annual retirement savings for low-income earners, including portable savings plans for gig workers, and provide 10 paid sick days for all Ontario workers.
So you're trying to get a deal.
What that costs?
Is what you're trying to do. You're trying to get me to do electoral platform costing without having, provided the resources. And I'm afraid that somebody else might pick up on this and pass a law. I don't know what I'm going to do. So just be careful what you ask here, right?
I want you to do it.
We could work it out. Absolutely, we could work it out. We need details. Let me go back, if I can, to when I was at my previous job in Ottawa, and we were asked to look at pharmacare and cost pharmacare. And there was quite a back and forth. It was actually a House committee that asked us to do it, which was kind of astounding. A lot of back and forth. We were trying to get them to nail down the formulary. So what are you covering? What drugs are you covering? And who is going to be eligible for this? And they wanted us to make that determination. And we kept saying, no, that's your job as policymakers. You set the policy. You've been elected, not us. And once you set the policy, we can cost it. And it's the same thing with the piece you just mentioned. So what are the details? How many people? How much money? What component? What's the uptake going to be? We go back to long-term care, what you talked about. So we can do that work. But it's not like stuff you can just push a button and it happens. It does take time.
Okay. Well, one thing you probably do know, because you would have done the sensitivity test, is the Liberals proposed to remove corporate taxes for small business for 2 years. Is that expensive?
No. I laugh because that is a regular thing that seems to pop up in everybody's campaign, plate. Small businesses, by and large, don't pay a lot of tax. And because they're small and they don't make scads of money to pay a lot of tax. So cutting taxes to small business doesn't have a very big financial or fiscal impact. Clearly the political impact makes it attractive. Otherwise nobody would be promising it. I guess kind of like these license sticker renewals, right? So somebody decided that people like getting checks and they thought it would be, make them feel good in an upcoming election. If people reacted differently, you might see some different things up on the table.
If people weren't human beings.
if they were economists, yeah, right. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Frankly, so I didn't say I wasn't an economist, did I?
So listen, for political parties that want to develop plans that are both prudent financially, but also take advantage of the fiscal opportunities that are there, what advice or cautions would you give them?
I think explain yourself, right? Why? What is behind the policy choices? So, mental health's a great example. What is the rationale for adding mental health to OHIP? And there's no question in my mind, there is a rationale. So explain the rationale, explain what you think it's going to cost in the longer term, over a 5-year period, and maybe over a longer term if you can, and why you think that's the right number, right? And then, of course, then there's the really hard question: how do you know when you've hit the targets you've set for yourself? How do you know when you're getting the outcomes that you want for this particular policy? That's a hard one. But the easier ones, and this is stuff that we suggest to MPPs on a regular basis. When the government comes to you, in our system of government, the government has to go to Parliament or the legislature and get legal permission to tax and to spend. And the people that give that legal permission are the people's representatives, or the MPPs. And my hope is, and that when MPPs are sitting there like a board of directors looking at a plan and the costs and the finances, what outcomes am I buying as a parliament? I'm giving you $175 billion to go spend next year. What am I buying for that? What outcomes are you trying to, are you promising me?
Right.
How do you know those are the right? How are you going to know when you get there? How much is it going to cost? Okay, you've given me the numbers. How do you know that's the right number? How do you know $1 billion on mental health is the right number?
Right.
What sort of work have you done to come up with that number? And is it reasonable? And these aren't easy questions to answer, but they're sure darn good questions to ask. And I think we do that, right? And it forces a little bit of consideration about, what's in and what's out and why, and you hopefully get a little better decision at the end of the game. And there may be a lot of political considerations that are baked into that as well. So, because ultimately, it's hard being in government because you have to maintain political buy-in.
It is better than the alternative, Peter.
No, I wasn't going there. I was going to say, that's democracy is better than the alternative. You have to, as a politician and as a government, you have to maintain political capital with your electorate. So you have to stay in power.
Yeah.
To be able to get some of the stuff done that you want to get done, which may not happen right away. It may be stuff that has to happen over a longer term, but you have to create that space to enable that longer term piece to work its way through. And that's a balancing act. So you have to do things like, promise people things before an election. If you think that's what's going to help you stay in power to help you get some of these other things done.
So lastly, for voters out there who are going to be trying to assess the commitments that parties are making to them, and that they won't come with detailed charts and stats like you produce. People will encounter these promises in advertisements. They will encounter them in brochures with bullet points, etc. What advice do you have for a voter on how to critically assess what parties are saying about what they're going to spend or do on taxes?
I think, maybe I sound like a broken record, but at what cost, right? What is the opportunity cost? What else could you be doing with this money that you've chosen not to do because you're doing this? And does what you're doing line up with what I think should be done? Or do I think you should be spending the money somewhere else?
Right.
I think that's one. And two is, if you can, and it's not always easy when you're trying to get through life, but what is going to be, is this going to be good for us as a province and for all of my fellow citizens going forward? And maybe does that benefit, that public benefit outweigh my own personal considerations? That's a really tough thing to do. But if you can, and you can step back for 20 seconds and think about it, I think that would be my suggestion. I don't want to pretend I'm giving people advice, but that would be my suggestion.
Awesome. Peter, this has been a really informative conversation and fun. You're always fun to talk to. So thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate the fact that you come on here and demystify and explain all these numbers for people. And I think at this point was particularly useful and helpful. So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our presenter. Always a pleasure. You'll come back?
Always a pleasure. Oh,
yeah.
If I'm invited, I'll come back. But we do have a bit of an outstanding issue here, and I think they're called cheeseburgers. Now, my fault last time. I am the one that got sick, but they're still outstanding.
This shall be done. Shall be done. You don't normally have to ask me twice to go for a cheeseburger. All right. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank all you Herle Burlyites out there for listening. Come back next week for more. Give us a rating or a review on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you watch this. And by the way, if you can tell from my shirt, remember, we have merch. All right, Peter, you'll get merch yourself. Merch. You're gonna get some merch. Anyway, thank you, everybody, and thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Peter. Take care. See you next week.
Okay. Thanks, David.